All right, so the paper that I chose to work on, I got it right here. The title that I have is "The Medium is the Mathematics." The main gist of it is that I wanted to look at the link between actually assessing math knowledge and the technology used in order to get those results. So one thing I've done when I was doing some work in my education classes for getting my license at Lake Erie College is we had to go to the Historical Society. At the Lake County Historical Society, we had to experience like a typical lesson in the 1800s. And there we learned about what they used to do for our education, one room schoolhouse. But the thing that struck me is that most of the lessons that they had planned were choral repetition. So they had a lot of songs in order to memorize things. They had some slate boards, and they talked to us about how this all was before the invention of the pencil, and how the pencil was like a disruptor essentially in the education space for that time. So I wanted to investigate that a little bit more because I was interested because at that time, then all of the exams that you would take, all the tests would all be oral exams. But once the pencil got widely adopted, then that would have to then switch to being written exams. So students who may have been excellent at memorization, when it came to writing things, maybe all of a sudden they weren't as good of a student. And the inverse would be true too. Students who weren't very good at memorizing things really quickly might be able to write something down, and just the act of writing it down might have given them the advantage then. So it was interesting. I looked a little bit into some of the histories of some of the tests that were taken. I didn't include this in my paper, but I did look up some of the histories of like the Iowa tests. Apparently, it was like in the 1920s is when they developed it, and it was one of the first big written tests that would be a standardized test. But just the invention of the pencil and the widespread use and the adoption of the pencil made it so that that was now a way that you could assess knowledge. I thought that was pretty interesting. So that was kind of why I chose to do this topic. Was because of that experience. I did find out some pretty interesting things. Sorry, I keep looking back and forth again. I took some notes. But anyway, so this kind of relates to some of the stuff that, again, as I was coming up through the system to get my license, that was when we were also switching from the OGT to the Park for standardized tests, which then got depreciated and became now the new air test. So even now, we're trying to grapple as to how do we actually assess knowledge of mathematics with the technology that we have? If we want to change from a paper-based test to a computer-based test, what are the new things that we can ask? What should be appropriate? And we'll actually suss out essentially the mathematics that students actually know. So I want to look at a couple different tools that we use in order to teach math, because if we're using tools to teach, we should be able to use those to assess. So doing some of my literature review, it seemed like the big advantage was things that were easy to be adopted. That seemed to be the big connection. If something's easy to adopt, then people will use it. The biggest thing I saw was intention to use, really related to actual use. So it wasn't the ability, so it wasn't how good you are with one sort of piece of technology, rather your intention to actually use that technology. And that kind of makes sense. If you're really good at something, but there's no real place for it in a course, it's not going to show up in a course. It has to be usable. So that was kind of the big spur that I found during my literature review. So again, I talked a little bit about standardized tests. And one of the big things is, again, our testing environment is now changing. We still have a little bit of both worlds, because we still have the ACT, and the ACT you can still take as a paper-based test. We still have our end-of-course tests in math, which are now totally computer-based. So students still have to flip-flop between the two different domains. I found that to be kind of interesting. And some students excel at one versus the other. So just knowing and preparing in that one environment, I did some research, and that actually does show to give higher scores if students are well prepared in the format of the test. So that was pretty interesting. So I wanted to look at exactly, well, what tools do you have for each of these tests? I don't know if anybody else has done oral exams, but if you do an oral exam, it's just you. That's all you've got. So but you know that, okay, well, going in, all I have is what I bring with me. That's fair. For a written exam, again, you show up to the exam. Again, I'll just take the ACT as an example. You know what you've got. You got the test booklet. You've got, maybe you brought your calculator with you, so you got your calculator. You got some pencils and the test booklet and the answer sheet. That's it. So you kind of know going in, hey, that's all that I have access to. But, and this is pretty cool, is that you can see all of that essentially at once. Nothing's really hidden from you. It's not like you have to flip back to page 17 in order to get some sort of knowledge that you need for question 35. So everything's kind of at hand. But if you've done any sort of practice with the Ohio State tests for the end of course exams, that's not the case. Everything is hidden behind menus. And so just getting the students to realize that there are those menus that they need to click through can be a bit of a hassle. I did find some research that shows that the extra step of actually clicking on those things does lead to a decrease in performance. Also, something I didn't include in the paper, just anecdotally, from looking at some stuff for advertising, that's the main goal of advertising, is you want to make it as little clicks as possible in order to buy something. And if you can do that with one less click, your profits are going to go up. Same idea here, though. If you can get the students to essentially have 1 or 0 clicks to get to where they need to go, it's going to be a lot more successful. And again, that relates back to the adoption of technology. If it's easy to use, it'll be widespread. So the other thing with the paper tests I talk about is some of the interaction pieces. You actually have a lot more interaction with a lot of paper-based assessments because you can write all over them. You can write on the pictures. You can do scratch work off to the side. On a digital test, you don't really have that. You might have an image, you might have a figure, and it might look a lot better than the one on paper. You might be able to zoom in or zoom out, but you don't always have the ability to write on those things. And I found that to be interesting because a lot of students, when they use technology, they use it to interact. They don't use it to just passively receive knowledge or passively give anything. And this is true with social media. Like, the whole point of it is to interact with something. So it's kind of strange that right now, and again, this can change because we're still developing our digital tests, but right now you have more interaction with a paper test than you do with a digital test. I found that kind of strange. So the next thing I talked about a little bit was calculators. I want to do a little bit of research into whether or not calculators are useful, specifically handheld calculators versus a digital calculator. So with the handheld calculators, I found any sort of calculator does help out. Handheld calculators are good, but the student needs to actually own the calculator in order for it to have the best effect. So classroom sets are nice, but they still do introduce inequality into the classroom because if a student is able to buy one of the handheld calculators that you're using in class and they can use it on the homework, they've got an advantage when it comes time for the test. So I did find a little bit of research that does show that. Granted, it was a TI study, so they might just want to be selling their calculators, but they did do the study. They did find that link, so I found that to be a little interesting. So then I want to talk a little bit, I went into a little bit of stuff about how to actually assess. So with new technology, you don't want to just use the same questions and just digitize them. You actually want to try and improve upon it. So I looked at rubrics as a form of assessment. I know we had some stuff with rubrics in the course, so I looked a little bit more about those. So they do offer a little bit more freedom. Because with rubrics, you're not just graded on the correct answer or the incorrect answer. You have to actually think about the rubric and make sure that you're actually meeting the criteria that you want to meet. So it was actually found to show that these rubrics, because of their open-ended nature, they actually let students develop some more of those higher thinking skills. They had to justify when they were looking at their criteria and to say, okay, does this actually fit the criteria? So it was a good option. So it's something to look at in conjunction with new technology is, well, how am I actually going to use an assessment tool with this? And that rubric piece seemed to help out with students to foster some of their creativity and to get them a little bit more involved in the assignment. So the other thing I wanted to look at was how much technology would be fine. I didn't really come to a big conclusion with this, but since the ODE standards, the standards for math practices, standard number 5, use appropriate tools strategically, it's good to present students with a lot of tools that they could use, a lot of options, because again, this is one of our goals for our mathematical practices. So just keeping things open-ended again with the rubrics does help out, because then they have to decide which piece of technology they actually want to use. So last thing, I talked very briefly about some more of the digital calculators, the algebraic solvers. So if they've got the algebra system, so this is things like Photomath, Mathway, and MathPapa. If you've taught algebra, you know that these things exist. But the question is, how do we leverage these to be useful instead of seeing them just as cheating mechanisms? And again, with rubrics, making some of the assessment criteria just be to explain why something works, not what the answer is, allows those pieces of technology to have a space, but not be the end-all be-all. So it kind of gets students out of the mindset of, well, this can just solve the question, so I don't really need to do anything else. But that explanation piece does help out. So that's everything that I had in my paper. I did want to talk about my conclusion. My handwriting is pretty terrible, and so if I was being assessed on a written test, my score may go down just because my handwriting isn't that great. So that was something that I thought about, like, okay, well, that's essentially the use of technology then would have been how well you can actually write, how quickly, how legibly you can actually do it. And that does relate to like our calculator menu knowledge. And I put in aesthetic choices for a presentation because these are things that, again, as we're seeing, we're going to be attracted to those, and those are going to subconsciously tell us, okay, well, how much does this person actually know based on what I can see in, say, their digital presentation. And that's the main goal, is to make new questions that blend the technology with the mathematics. So that's my main point, is that that's something that we need to look at, and that doing that is going to help us to become better teachers.